It's Agent RX, and welcome back to the next prescription. Today, our episode will be continuing our series of interviews where we interact with people all around the fields of biology. In this episode, I'd like to welcome Dr. Pavan Shah.
Hey, I'm Pavan. I'm a neurosurgery resident at Stanford, have a deep interest in biotech and have been involved in all sorts of the space, ranging from traditional wet lab research to working with startups that are using AI to transform drug discovery.
Why did you choose neurosurgery in that field of medicine?
Yeah, I think the acuity of patient care in neurosurgery is truly unique. So, when I was going through my rotations in medical school, one of the things that I valued the most was being there for patients when times were the toughest and helping them through that. And that's a lot of what neurosurgery is. Beyond that, the procedures are really cool. You get to operate on the brain, you get to fix both back pain and back deformity when you do spine work. So, there's also a range of things that you can touch within neurosurgery. People typically think of it as very specialized, which it is, but even within that, there's a broad range of things that you can do.
Do you, by any chance, know if there's a specialty you're gonna go into in neurosurgery or just as a whole?
I'm really interested broadly right now. I just started a couple of months ago in my residency, but all of my research to date has been in the oncology space, so I'm thinking something tumor related.
Okay, that's cool. Next, I'd like to ask, why did you get into biology and medicine? Maybe we can start off with biology.
I sort of viewed biology as a vehicle to do medicine. I think biology is very interesting because it's one of the spaces that, in terms of like the foundational sciences, when you think about them, is the most quote unquote fuzzy, right? So when you think about problem solving in physics or mathematics, it's typically very one plus one equals two. It's very well defined. But in biology, even today, with all of the tools and technologies that we have, people have very well formed hypotheses that don't often carry out when they perform experiments or do investigations just because of the inherent complexity of biological systems. And I thought that that was really cool from a young age.
Do you have like a specific class or do you have a specific, do you know when you start to feel this interest? So was it in high school? Was it in college? Med school, maybe?
Yeah, so I mean, the interest towards biology was there from a really early age. I actually had a teacher in high school who I still remember, Dr. Fout, who was sort of foundational in my interest in biology. She really inspired us to think beyond sort of what was just in the textbook and presented us in plain text and really the rationale and foundational underpinnings of what we were learning, which I thought was really cool. Beyond that, I got to undergrad. I was a biomedical engineering major. I spent a summer interning at Medtronic, and I actually felt like, while that was really exciting, I did want to be a little bit closer to patient care. So when I decided I want to do biology and biomedical engineering within that space, I think that was transformational in telling me that I wanted to do patient care.
See. Did you ever wish that you had something to introduce you to this biology concept before high school? Because most people, I feel like your main biology course you take freshman year. But did you ever wish, like maybe in like eighth grade, if you went more in depth or elementary school?
Well, for me, I think it was different too because my mother is actually in healthcare. She's a physician. So I grew up in and around the practice of medicine, always having a really deep respect for providing care for patients. So it's really, I think, hard for me personally to reflect on that. But I think hearing, voices of peers and colleagues along the way, I think it would be helpful to have a deeper dive into biology or healthcare earlier, just because it is such a specialized path that's so different from any other industry job. I think knowing as early as you can that you're potentially interested in it is helpful.
Mhm. And did you do any like clubs or extracurriculars during your like elementary years in high school or college, during college?
Ooh, elementary school, grades, grade school is honestly hard for me to remember at this point. I don't think I did anything particularly biology focused in high school other than work at a lab at ASU,
Mhm.
doing research in like foundational biology. It was looking at various genetic markers for, bacteria. It was like a very long time ago. In college, I did research the entire time I was there with an oncology lab as well that was looking at different markers for prostate cancer.
Mhm.
Beyond that, I did a variety of like, volunteering orgs, both with like patients as well as just with like grade school kids that were in the neighborhood. but nothing that was in particular, I think, standing out as transformational. I think most of that had already happened when I decided in, high school that I wanted to pursue medicine.
What about like unrelated to biology? Just some things to get to know you, I guess.
Yeah, so like I said, I think the other element of my interest is sort of on the business side of healthcare, more particularly recently in exciting developments in biotech and digital health. So I was a biomedical engineering major when I was at USC, which obviously put me in the engineering college. So a lot of my closest friends were, computer scientists, software engineers, and I also kind of caught the bug for all of the hackathons and those types of things. So I was engaged in a lot of those things in college. I think that sort of set the precedent for me to then spend time at like a digital health startup while I was in med school. I then spent a couple of years at McKinsey actually doing consulting just to learn more about the business side of healthcare. So I think in terms of my professional interest, that is definitely one side that I've been able to flesh out to a good degree, I think, for someone who's still so early in their career.
Okay, it's very interesting. Now, since you've been talking a lot about like bioengineering and biotechnology, I want to hear just your basic thoughts on it as a whole, on a general spectrum.
Yeah, so I think, first maybe useful to define what I think of as biotechnology. And I think of biotech today as sort of the entire pipeline, right? So from the very early days, like it's an academic lab, how are they coming up with hypotheses, to the very end of the tail, right? Which is like you're doing the phase 3 and final clinical trials to see which drugs are actually going to be available to patients. And I think the time that we're in right now is actually really exciting for that entire spectrum of very, very early hypothesis defining to optimizing clinical trials. So at the really earliest stages, there's these really cool AI tools that are coming out now that are changing how people think about hypothesis generation. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. So Google actually has an AI co-scientist that helps people come up with hypotheses and potential candidates for various investigations that they're running. It's been around for a little while, but actually in just the last couple of months, there's been a couple of really big wins for this platform. So there was one paper that was by a scientist at Stanford by the name of Gary Peltz, where he was looking at testing drugs that are already on the market for their ability to target liver fibrosis. And so he picked two drugs that he thought would be, potentially applicable to this. And he asked this AI co-scientist to also pick a couple of drugs. So that AI co-scientist picked three. And then when they were looking at lab models of liver tissue, actually two of the three AI picks ended up having some sort of effect, and his two picks didn't have much of an effect at all. So this is sort of showing the promise of how we're redefining hypothesis generation and candidate selection. There's also a paper by microbiologists at Imperial College London that was looking at how little DNA fragments were spreading between bacteria. And there was already some ideas around how they spread among bacteria of the same species, but they were actually seeing spread across various species of bacteria. And they'd spent years on in a wet lab, like trying to experiment about how this is being done, and already had a leading hypothesis. It turns out they gave the same background data that they had when they started these experiments to this AI co-scientist, and it was able to generate the same leading hypothesis in only a couple of days with no experiments. And so they actually published both of those papers in Cell, which is like one of the most prestigious science journals in the world. So that's a little bit on the early side. There's also new startups like really big names that have raised massive early funding are like Chai Discovery, which predicts interactions between biochemical molecules, and evolutionary scale, which is like a frontier model for biology. They're also sort of changing the earliest stages.
Mhm.
But then if you think about the other end, right? Like now things are already in clinical trials, like how do we pick the right patients and how do we make those clinical trials as efficient as possible? There's also changes that are being made there. So for example, there's these things called digital twins. This is used broadly across the AI space, but particularly in clinical trials, you can generate sort of these quote unquote twins of patients that allow you to better adjust for other factors that could affect why a patient is responding the way that they do. Right? So like, whenever someone runs a clinical trial, some patients get the drug, some patients don't. But there's also a bunch of different things that could potentially be different among the patients, right? Like their age, their other sicknesses, how healthy they are at baseline. And so AI is making the way that you can adjust for those things more efficient so you can see more clearly what the effect your drug is having.
So would you say you're more interested though in the hypothesis side and hypothesis generation of biotechnology? Because that's something I'm actually hearing for the first time and I find very interesting.
You're saying among the solutions that are coming out in AI across the spectrum?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that is the most like exciting and most foundational, right? I think obviously all of these are really important for patients. Like in terms of getting the right drugs to the right patients, I think the patient selection tools are just as valuable as the early stage tools. But I think the early stage tools have more potential to really redefine how we think about drug discovery.
Yeah. And also, I feel like it can also just help us find new medicines and just new ways of thinking about biotechnology. Probably think of new solutions that we would never think of before. Like, I mean, CRISPR-Cas9, right? Like, maybe we could have, with AI, we might have come up with something like that much sooner. So I think it is very promising and something I'd like to look into more.
The other thing that these systems are really good at, right, is like processing large amounts of data.
Mhm.
There's often an issue with quality control, right? Though, but the thing with research is a lot. If you just train your models on peer-reviewed research, or if you're only looking at that as your foundation for what you're asking, then I think that there's a lot of promise there. But there's a lot of literature, right? It's really hard for an individual scientist to read everything that's relevant in a particular field, versus these models can do that to a better degree. So I think the AI co-scientist thing is really cool and something I'll be keeping a close eye on.
Yeah. Now I'd like to ask, what are some future applications of you think of this co-scientist in your particular field of medicine, so like neuroscience or neurosurgery?
I think the AI I'm going to transition a little bit here and actually, if that's okay, talk about the surgical side because I think there's really cool things there as well.
Uh-huh.
So, in addition to these sort of, research tools that are changing how we discover drugs, there's actually tools that are coming out that might redefine how we do surgery. And if you think about, the things that will let robots do autonomously, one of the things that's been back and forth forever is the driving thing, right? Like you could argue that, Waymo and these companies that have self-driving cars, they've actually been better than human drivers for a long time. But it took a while for people to get around to the idea that they're comfortable with fully autonomous vehicles driving them around. That is context. I think it might take a while for these tools to get implemented as autonomous surgical tools, but there are actually companies and research labs working on surgical robots that can perform surgeries all by themselves. So I went to medical school at Johns Hopkins, and actually some of the frontier research labs for robotics are based out of Hopkins. There was a group recently that published a paper showing that they had just fed this autonomous agent video of gallbladder surgeries in pigs, and then allowed it to perform those surgeries, and it did like 8 of them without having any errors, which is super impressive. Again, this is super early days for technology like this, but it just shows you the promise that it has, right? Like these are very very powerful tools that we can use to potentially optimize a range of operations. And obviously, if you think about the range of surgical complexity, gallbladder surgery is actually one of the more simple ones, which makes it a great place to start. But I think that that is truly just the start. I think we'll see it applied in a number of different places, including eventually neurosurgery.
That's amazing. And it's just so, every time I hear about just biotechnologies or do research into it, my mind gets blown of how fast and rapidly we're just evolving. I'd also like to ask you, is there a change you'd like to see in like the medical world and the biological world and just science as a whole? So it can be related to biotechnology, but it doesn't have to be.
I think one thing that's really cool that we're seeing right now is historically medicine has sort of been a place where innovation was primarily found in scientific research, and this just meant publishing in the highest impact factor journals, having the greatest number of publications. But sort of that was seen to some degree as the end product. Like you just wanted to be the most prolific, most high impact scientific researcher.
Mhm.
However, that really for patients is not the endpoint, right? Because something could make it really far and have a really big impact in terms of research. But if it doesn't actually affect how patients are cared for, then it to some degrees was a failure. And so I think right now there's a greater recognition of research not being the end all be all, but being a vehicle to get things to patients. And so for a long time, there's been this concept of this like chasm between bench and the bedside, right? That there's really cool things that are promising in research, but there's still a lot of needs at the bedside. And how do we bridge that gap? I think that there is more and more scientists in medicine now who are interested in getting, discoveries to the bedside by whichever vehicle possible. And this means sometimes not publishing in the highest impact journal, but instead partnering with industry to see how you can push something into clinical trial, or pursuing a number of different vehicles to see how you can get things to patients. And I think that's been really cool to see because I think that the divide between academic medicine and industry is only getting smaller and smaller. And the people that will benefit the most from that are the patients themselves.
Right. So just increase collaboration as throughout the field is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. And not viewing, publishing good research as the endpoint, but viewing transforming patient care as the endpoint.
Mhm. Well, thank you for your time today. It's been amazing getting to know you and an honor to have you on my podcast. Would you have any final thoughts you'd like to say?
Yeah, I think it's just a really exciting time to be in medicine. I think that, like I mentioned, I think AI and some of the new tools that are coming out are foundationally changing the way that we deliver medicine and, discover and act on new drug candidates. And I think for anybody who's considering this field, I think it would definitely behoove them to become savvy with these tools because I think more and more they're going to become commonplace in our practice of medicine.
Oh, awesome. Thank you all for tuning in today, and until next time, this is Agent RX signing out.